I didn't catch. I just catch the last end. So sorry. My freeze every sometimes, but yeah. My name is Tim. From Six Nations. Currently in Ancaster and Hamilton, outside of Hamilton, and here to give the land acknowledgement. The city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron, Wyandotte, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant, which was agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the between the lakes purchase uh 1990 no 1792, I'm sorry, um between the crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island of North America. And we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land, that so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on. It is important to understand that the long standing history that has brought you here. The Hamilton Acorn is dedicated to honoring the land that we reside on and recognizing the experience of Indigenous and First Nations people across Canada. We will post some resources about the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant in the chat for you to learn more. And I'll pass it over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Timothy. For anyone new that has joined the meeting, ACORN is a national membership organization made up of low and moderate income people fighting for change. We have been active since 2004. We have 24 chapters in 9 cities across Canada with 140,000 members. We even have ACORN members around the world. Our campaigns are focused on social and economic justice. ACORN has been organizing in Hamilton since 2017. We have 3 chapters in the city: downtown, East End, and Hamilton Mountain. We organized this meeting to bring together ACORN members, allies, and city councilors to discuss the housing crisis in Hamilton and urgent need of local action. We have special guests today in our discussion. City Councillor Jaimie McEvoy from New Westminster, British Columbia. He is a big advocate for protecting tenants against renoviction, saving affordable housing and homelessness, and helped pass the first municipal anti-renoviction bylaw in Canada. We're also joined by Ali from Hamilton Community Legal Clinic and Marima from SPRC. As we know, the housing crisis in Hamilton has gone from bad to horrific. Low and moderate income tenants are facing the brunt of the crisis. COVID-19 has further amplified the crisis impact on the most vulnerable in our community, including seniors, single-parent families, people with disabilities, low-wage workers, and racialized people. The city of Hamilton was taking important first steps in the past 13 months to address the local housing issues. First, with a motion to modify the guidelines and criteria of 5 financial incentive programs for developers to ensure city funds given to developers is not leading the tenant displacement, and passing a motion to review and update the city's apartment property standards to ensure that all health and safety issues of tenants face are included. These efforts from the city demonstrate the importance of consulting with tenants and community groups that know the first-hand how the housing crisis is impacting low-income and vulnerable communities. More must be done, and bold action must be taken. The city has the power, and ACORN looks forward to working together with council and community partners to protect tenants. The two areas of housing crisis that ACORN's campaign has focused on is substandard housing and renovictions. We see those two issues, as the main threats to existing markets of affordable housing in Hamilton. All tenants need healthy homes and protection against losing their homes, especially as the trend continues of REITs, which stands for Real Estate Investment Trusts, and also private equity firms that are buying up Hamilton's affordable housing stock. Low and moderate income communities are just seen as opportunities to deliver huge returns to their investors and living tenants in substandard living, and at a very high risk of violence if tenants decide not to move. While we all acknowledge provincial and federal governments will need to come forward with funding and strong policy to end housing crisis, collectively, municipalities have a vital role to play in ending the crisis in Ontario. Hamilton has an opportunity to lead the way in Ontario by passing legislation that protects tenants from both renoviction, substandard housing, and protects the city's market affordable housing stock. Other Ontario cities have already taken steps to strengthen regulations of landlords when it comes to substandard housing. Example, Toronto and Ottawa. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker from SPRC, Marima. I'll try to pronounce your last name, Marima, but please introduce yourself when you start. Marima Mensilutsky. Marima currently works as the project coordinator of the Tools for Tenants' Rights project. A legal information project is in partnership with the Social Planning and Research Council, the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, and funding made available by the Law Foundation of Ontario. She completed her master's work analyzing the connections between property, displacement, and immigrant identities, and is currently completing her first year of law school as part of the this one too, please. Inaugural class at Ryerson University's Faculty of Law. Thank you, Marima, and welcome.
Thank you, Veronica, and you pronounced my name perfectly. You made it through that very long bio, so thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone tonight for coming out. So I'm just going to be speaking for a bit to provide some context about the housing crisis that's taking place in Hamilton. And I'd really like to get started with that conversation by highlighting the fact that I think there's been a lot of discussion, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, about the housing crisis, not just in Hamilton, but across really the province of Ontario. We've also been having these conversations at a national level. And I don't think I can adequately do that topic justice in a very quick overview, but I do think that it is important to try to understand some of the roots, so some of the reasons why we find ourselves in a housing crisis today, and then also the different responsibilities that I think different levels of government have towards that housing crisis. And I think, like Victoria had sort of initially introduced, I think the connections between different things that the municipality can take, so that the city of Hamilton can take different responsibilities at a provincial level as it relates to the Residential Tenancies Act and evictions, and then really a national housing strategy that is at a federal level are all interconnected. And so I think it's important to say that and to name that, and also to have a conversation just a bit about the reasons why tenants often find themselves in this position where they're looking to negotiate for basic, adequate, and safe housing. And a lot of that also has to do with this broader sort of concern and the connections between property and colonialism. And so I think it's important to name those things as roots to this housing crisis that we're speaking about today. And so as it relates specifically to the Hamilton context, the Social Planning and Research Council has done a tremendous amount of research in this field over the last really 5 or 6 years. And you can find more information about the publications on their website, which I will link as soon as I'm done talking into the chat here. But it is important to note that in the city of Hamilton from 2010 to about 2016, that's some of the most recent data that we have, there's been an increase of 95% in L2 type evictions at the landlord tenant board. And those are the types that are really connected to, in part, the renovictions crisis that we're going to be talking about today, concerns about substandard housing and tenants being pushed out or displaced from their housing. And it's also important to note that a lot of the affordable housing that currently does exist in Hamilton is primarily located in the lower portion of the city. So think about Hamilton and all of its ways it gets divided, the mountain, Dundas, Ancaster, a whole bunch of different geographical ways to define it. The bulk of the affordable housing is really in the lower city. And a lot of that affordable housing is affordable housing that long-term tenants are holding on to. So we're thinking about tenants who have been in their units for 5, 10, even 15 years. And part of the reason why that is some of the most affordable housing available in the city is really due in part to a provincial sort of legislation or provincial approach to housing, which is rent decontrol. So that when a new tenant moves into a unit or the old tenant leaves, the amount that a landlord can charge on that unit for the new tenant is not regulated or controlled. So a landlord can set it as high as possible. And when we think about the importance for tenants to hold on to that housing, a portion of that discussion is how they understand their rights. And so I work on the Tools for Tenants' Rights project, and I've spent the better part of 1.5 years along with Ali, who's another speaker, who does a lot of great legal information across the city, along with a lot of the housing staff at the legal clinic. But another component to that as well is the responsibilities that landlords have to not just ensure that their tenants are well taken care of, that they're meeting the needs that they said that they would under the lease agreement, but also that landlords are performing those essential repairs and that they're performing the essential work that's required, that's part of the rights that tenants have that's associated with their unit. And so when we're talking about the housing crisis, there's a lot of different components that come into play there, but there's also a power imbalance that tenants experience on an everyday basis. Their relationship with landlords are very complicated. And for a lot of tenants in the city, you sort of understand that you want to have as that the housing that you hold on to is really dependent upon you having a good relationship. And so when we're thinking about different strategies that the municipality has to those tenants, different responsibilities rather that the municipality has to those tenants, there's been a lot of discussion about things that the province can do to ensure affordable housing is maintained for tenants, to ensure that tenants are having their rights respected at the landlord-tenant board. And certainly, as we're looking at some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had, there's a huge conversation to be had there. But I also think that there's an important conversation to be had at a municipal level. And a lot of the advocacy work that ACORN has been doing has been asking the city to get more creative with its solutions, not just for affordable housing and safe housing and standards to that housing, but also for ensuring that tenants are better equipped and are in a better position to have their rights respected and are more aware of the process associated with evictions, are more aware of the process associated with their rights to stay in their housing, so that affordable housing that so many tenants do occupy in the lower city can be held onto. And really, I think COVID-19 has highlighted in a lot of different ways the need for cities to become more creative with their approaches, because This housing crisis has been going on for the better part of a decade. People keep talking about it. It changes, it fluctuates, it gets worse as the years go on, and certainly COVID-19 has exacerbated it. But municipalities can play a large role in ensuring that some of the response to that, certainly not on its own, but that some of that response to the housing crisis is meaningful and sustained and actually speaks to the needs of tenants on the ground. And so with that, if that's okay, I might turn it over to the next speaker, who probably has quite a bit about to say concerning the creativity of municipalities and what they can do to prevent renovictions and also maintain sustainable and affordable housing.
Great. Thank you, Marima. Thank you. Yes, I will introduce our next speaker is Jaimie McEvoy. Jaimie McEvoy is an author, historian, and four-term city councillor in New Westminster, BC, near Vancouver. First elected in 2008, Jaimie is chair of the city's Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and chair of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing. Working together with the local chapter of ACORN, Jaimie successfully introduced the first municipal living wage policy in Canada. Prior to being elected, Jaimie worked as a director for a United Church project to provide a variety of assistance to clients of the food bank, which included running a homelessness prevention program that assisted people and intervened to prevent people from becoming homeless. Jaimie currently provides local citizens with a newsletter on the state of the pandemic. In New Westminster, he is best known for his love of cats. That's great. Yes, I love cats too, Jaimie. It's really great. Welcome, Jaimie, and it's our pleasure to have you from our ACORN members. We're really excited to hear from you.
Thank you. So many years ago, can you hear me okay, by the way? Okay, good. Many years ago, as an average citizen, I booked an appointment at City Hall to ask, what are the city's environmental policies? So why do I mention that? Well, I mention it because I got the same answers that people are being told about housing today. I was told there aren't any policies. I was told that it would be impossible, that it's not our jurisdiction, that there was no way it could be done. I was even told it would be illegal. But today, nearly every city has some sustainability in environmental policies and practices in place. When I was first elected in 2008, New Westminster was just beginning to draft an affordable housing policy. And I was fortunate because my election was the one that created a majority in favor of that. But that policy at that time was more about what the city would not do than what it would. So we began addressing the housing crisis in small ways at first, but it got worse. The housing crisis got worse. Apartment buildings that had been owned by individuals, sometimes for 30, 40 years, started to be bought up by entities that were more interested in the revenue than the housing, and less interested in the individual tenants who lived there and what their circumstances were. In BC, we have a degree of rent control as long as the tenant lives there. When a tenant moves out, the rent can be increased to any level. So some landlords saw that loophole, and we began to have a real renoviction crisis. Renovations just for the sake of forcing tenants out to take advantage of that loophole. In some of those cases, repairs were needed. But I asked people, think about it. Did the tenants really have to be forced to move out? And we did a review as a city, we did a review of our building permits. We looked at building permits for strata and condominiums, and we looked at the building permits for rental buildings. And what we learned was that when people owned the apartment, they almost never had to move out for the same work to be done that renters were being forced out almost every time. And some of those renovations were small things. Replace a countertop, call it a renovation and evict the tenant. One case, it was painting a bathroom. One clever building owner replaced the building's boiler in the summertime and evicted 13 floors of tenants on the grounds that they would have no heat while the boiler was being replaced in July. And sometimes a landlord just lied and no renovations were done after the evictions had happened. So we wanted to make change, but we were frustrated. Cities operate under provincial law, and we had no legal right, for example, to withhold or deny building permits. This idea, this fatalism, was largely accepted in our cities, the idea that there's just nothing we could do. So we decided, and we actually decided formally, we're going to change our mindset and we're going to change our instructions to our staff. And we said, let's find out what we can do. We might be the first, so let's think outside of the box, but we're not going to accept any more that we can't do anything. So let's start thinking, what is that way? Our position and our instructions to our staff were we are going to do something. We didn't know what it was, but it was a pretty big change in how people approached the issue and how people thought. We couldn't figure out how to deal with the building permits. We did introduce some processes that helped with that, but we couldn't figure out a legal way. But we do have the power to license business. And we have the power to regulate business licenses. And so that's what we did. And when you think about it, historically, rental housing has always been a business. The only business, though, that doesn't require a license to be in business. Most of our rental housing was now owned by registered corporations. Why shouldn't they have a business license? This is, in fact, their business. They say so themselves. So on February 5th, 2019, we adopted the Business Regulations and Licensing Rental Units Bylaw, Bylaw 83110, Bylaw 8310, 2019, if anyone wants to look it up. This bylaw controls how building owners can undertake renovations and places restrictions on evictions. We have a Residential Tenancies Act in BC, and we were careful that no part of the licensing bylaw conflicted with the Tenancy Act. In fact, we effectively made it so respecting the Tenancy Act was a condition of having the business license. Violations of the bylaw are subject to fines of $500 to $1,000. That doesn't sound like much when you get to change the rent on an apartment. So we had to make sure that any enforcement would be effective. So those fines can be levied every single day. A landlord can face a new $500 to $1,000 fine every single day that they are not complying with the business license regulations. Ultimately, we could withdraw the business license, and because the business license is required, that landlord would no longer be allowed to rent units. I mean, that would be the far end of enforcement because we understand that could impact tenants as well. But if we had a situation where we had a real slumlord and a dangerous building and there were really just harming tenants, we could actually remove their right to continue to rent to people. Our bylaw was challenged in court. And whenever I talk to people in other jurisdictions, I always hear this argument about the legality. I'm not aware of a jurisdiction in Canada where cities don't have some right to license and regulate business. We were the first. So we knew, we were very careful and very deliberate. We knew it was important to have a bylaw that would hold up in court. And a year after the bylaw was adopted, on 11th February 2020, just in time for the pandemic, the Business Regulations and Licensing Rental Units Bylaw was held up in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. The court dismissed the petition on a number of grounds, but really a rather simple ground ruled that the bylaw was in fact within the city's powers. So the legal question and the legal issue was settled a year after we adopted our bylaw. We had threats from builders, we had threats from developers that they would never again build in New Westminster, but none of that ever happened. And it didn't actually come from builders who were building in New Westminster or had a relationship with the city, but that threat did concern our council, and it caused a lot of other councillors in BC to hesitate. But It never happened. Nothing ever came of it. Once the bylaw was in place, it was just another fact of life. And in fact, we had some builders of rental housing who were feeling frustrated with the city's lack of policy, felt like they had to wheel and deal with the planning department every time they did something. And so we actually had some who were thankful that we adopted some clear policy. And we provide support. When a landlord wants to make renovations, our City Department of Development Services and our building department works with them on how that can happen with minimal impact on tenants, just as we already did with condo buildings. If a tenant does have to be moved out, the licensing bylaw requires the landlord to provide alternative accommodation to the tenant so the tenant can move back in at the same rent they were paying before. We also did some things with our zoning powers as well. We had an overall package in addition to our rental units bylaw. We adopted a rental replacement policy. That means that any rental units lost to development must be replaced by the developer as part of the development. So there's not a lot of incentive in buying a 3-story building to tear it down to build a new 3-story building. You can't, you have to have it, you have to replace the rental units. And this has effectively limited dem evictions. We haven't had any dem evictions in New Westminster. And part of that also is because we have a policy not to allow higher buildings to be built in place of the buildings that were torn down. We have height restrictions, which any city can do. So there's no incentive to buy a 3-story building, tear it down, and think you're going to build a 12 or a 30-story building, because that just won't be allowed. We do have a carrot to the stick. We created a rental revitalization tax exemption. So if an owner needs to make significant renovations, but they agree to have a covenant on title that they will not renovate, the city will give them a little bit of tax break for a while. We also use our planning process to get more rental built. It's actually a simple formula. We have building heights up to a certain height. The developers typically want a greater height, so they can, and if they include affordable housing or rental housing, they can ask for the buildings to be built taller. It's a pretty simple mechanism. And sometimes we just ask. We have a tenant displacement policy. If a developer has bought a building with tenants and that building absolutely needs to be demolished or have a full renovation, we actually have one building in this circumstance that's getting close to a state of collapse. We required the developer to be absolutely sure that every tenant is successfully relocated. This is something that's always bothered me. We don't know what happens with the tenants. Nobody does, and so nobody has to take responsibility. And so we required this company to do this, and they actually came up with the idea that they were going to hire a tenant coordinator whose job it was to track every single tenant and make sure that the tenants had new affordable housing that had to move. So the outcome is that there have been no mass renovations since we applied the bylaw. We were getting to a point of having a dozen or more a year. Before that crisis, it would be a bad year if we had 2 or 3 fully renovated buildings. So we've had none since adopting the bylaw. I don't know if people are interested in the legal argument, but I can tell you a little bit about it and I can send information. But basically, the courts ruled that the city has a right to adopt a bylaw. The city has a right to adopt a bylaw for whatever reasons it wants to, as long as it's within the city's powers. The court ruled that every councillor gave 12 different reasons for why they want the bylaw. As long as one of those reasons is legally valid, the bylaw is still valid. The petitioner was going to argue that they're not a business, but they saw no legal path forward in making that argument. And in fact, the court dealt with it anyway. And the court just said very clearly, this is a business. Cities have the right to regulate business. And case law has said that the word business has a fairly broad application to it. And that case law would apply anywhere in Canada. So like anywhere else, we can't adopt a bylaw that contravenes provincial law, but we can overlap with provincial law. And so our bylaw allows us to effectively be another mechanism of enforcement for the Residential Tenancy Act. Even though it's outside of our jurisdiction, we're not allowed to contradict that act, but we are allowed to overlap provincial law. And so there's other things that we did as a city, but I think that gives you a bit of an outline. We made sure we hired social planning and housing staff. We have a tenant displacement bylaw. If the city has an enforcement action that results in tenants having to move, the city itself takes responsibility for finding those tenants new housing. And we're currently working on projects where we've made city land available for social housing projects. So that's an outline. I'll be glad to take questions later.
Great, thank you, Jaimie, so much. Bravo for like you and everyone that you've talked to. You have, I'm sure, saved a lot of tenants, and yeah, it's really great to have you here again and share the information with us. This is a big thing. And important too, to hear, you know, from the first city in Canada to pass an anti-renoviction legislation, you know, that it would solve some other issues, like you said, and, you know, so great. Thank you very much. We are going to have some questions after our next speaker and some tenants speaking from Hamilton. So save your questions and write them down too if you want to, if you need to. I already wrote my first question. So our next speaker is Ali Nadegi. And Ali is a staff lawyer at Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, where he provides advice to clients in matters related to income maintenance, disability, and housing. He frequently represents clients and the landlord and tenant board and engages in public legal education. Thank you, Ali, and welcome.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me. Can anyone hear me? Okay. So my contribution to tonight is going to be very brief. I'm just going to talk about some of the trends that we are seeing with regards to renovations and the increase in renovations in big cities like Hamilton, Toronto, where there's a lot of stock of old housing, old buildings. So I'll talk about that, but before that, I want to thank Jaimie for his wonderful presentation. It's inspiring to have counselors like you, and I wish more cities like ours had counselors like you that actually care about the needs of working people and low-income people and put those interests above profits and the profit motive, like, you know, for the developers. So it's very inspiring to have you know, this model, and I think you know, our clinic is in support of something like this, or being implemented in the city of Hamilton and Toronto, you know, in every major city in Ontario. I think it would go a long way to make it a little more fair and equitable for tenants. Having said that, the regime when it comes to renovations in Ontario is set out in the Residential Tenancies Act. So Section 53 of the Residential Tenancies Act allows a landlord to serve a notice of termination, which some of you have probably received one and are familiar with this notice. It's the N13 notice, which provides that the landlord must serve the notice in writing, and the termination date must be minimum 120 days after the notice is served. And there are a number of reasons that the landlord can serve this notice. So namely, one of the reasons is to demolish the unit or the residential complex. Another reason is to do repairs or renovations so extensive that the landlord is required to get a permit or a building permit, and that the unit must be vacant to do the work. And lastly, that they intend to convert the rental unit from a residential use to a commercial use or a non-residential use, right? So those are the three reasons that the landlord can try to evict the tenant for renovations. Just like Jamie said, a lot of times the landlords don't serve these notices in good faith, right? Because of the vacancy decontrol that also exists in Ontario, many long-term tenants are at the risk of receiving these notices because their rents cannot go up more than the guideline rent increase. So the landlord or an investment firm like the real estate investment trusts, they come in, they buy, you know, a bulk of these old buildings, and in order to return, you know, to get a significant return on their investment, it would make sense for them to evict tenants, to either demolish the building, convert it to a, you know, condo, change the rental aspect to a condominium corporation, or do some renovations, basic touch-ups, so that they can re-rent the unit at any amount they want, right? So even if your rent is $500 and you get evicted, the landlord can legally set the rent to $3,000 if they want to, right? There's no regulation on the amount of increase that they can put on that new unit. So that's a major problem because it incentivizes these types of business ventures to, you know, essentially force out old tenants by a lot of means, by intimidation, by harassment, by coercion. And we see a lot of that in our clinic. There's been an increase, I would say, in these types of notices in the last few years that we are seeing, and also the applications that are being filed at the landlord and tenant board. So, you know, seeing the results and how they displace and change communities, I think it's really important for our city to also develop and implement a similar bylaw to what Jamie has successfully done in New Westminster. I think there's a lot of practical solutions that we can learn from this bylaw in BC, and namely, like, most of these renovations do not actually require the tenant to move out. They are minor renovations, they're minor touch-ups. And so there needs to be some sort of a oversight to, you know, make sure that the landlord does not force the tenant to move out to, you know, basically change a countertop or change the light bulbs, right? That's not a major renovation. Another issue with the tenants is that even though the Residential Tenancies Act actually gives the tenants a right of first refusal, so they can request the landlord that they intend to move back in once the renovations are done. But we see most of the times, a lot of times, landlords don't respect that tenant's right of first refusal. So they go ahead and they actually re-rent the unit to new tenants at much higher rent, and they assume the risk at that point, right? Because a lot of times the landlords rely on tenants not following through with litigation to enforce their rights of first refusal, right? And even if the tenant does, a maximum amount that the tenant can recover at the landlord-tenant board is $25,000, which is really rare. So even if in a worst case scenario for the landlord, even if they're ordered to pay a tenant $25,000 for serving a bad notice or not respecting the right of first refusal, they can recover that money pretty quickly by increasing the rent. So again, from a business standpoint, it makes sense for the landlords to still, you know, not respect the right of first refusal and actually breach on their you know, contractual obligation with the tenant, right? And those are the things that hopefully, you know, we can, you know, advocate in the city to make changes to, right? That type of oversight is needed. Also, a lot of tenants don't have the means to litigate once they move out. You know, especially low-income tenants, you know, tenants with a lot of financial hardship, with, you know, health issues. They don't have the time nor the means to follow a rigorous and a complicated legal process, right? So there are cases that some tenants may actually succeed, but overwhelming number of tenants do not follow through, even if they are evicted illegally by these renoviction tactics. So that is again something that, you know, we as a legal aid clinic, we can, you know, advise tenants to sort of fight back as much as they can. But ultimately, this is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed through organizing, through political change. Because, you know, we have to give advice to tenants within the legal framework that exists. And we cannot, you know, as much as we want to, we cannot change the law or change the rules. So, you know, I think one of the best and most effective way is having, you know, organizations like ACORN pushing for this type of change and advocating and organizing. So I applaud ACORN for having Jaimie talk about this important issue. And, you know, in terms of tenants receiving notices, we always, you know, I can't give a legal advice at the moment, but if you receive an M13 notice, please contact our legal clinic. I'm gonna put a link to our website in the chat function. So please call us, get individual advice from our caseworkers and our lawyers about your rights and options when you receive an M13. So that concludes my short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you. And thank you again, Councillor McEvoy and Ali and Marima joining us tonight. It's clear what is at stake. New Westminster showed what is possible. We need our communities protected over the profit of predatory landlords and developers. Now we're going to hear from ACORN members on their experience with renoviction in Hamilton. ACORN members know firsthand the impact of living in an apartment with lack of repairs, building maintenance, and pests, and being pressured by the landlord to move out. First, I would like to pass it to Paula first to speak. She is an ACORN member. Thank you, Paula.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So I've been asked to just give you a quick synopsis of my situation, or I should say our situation in my building here. I live in a very charming old 3-story brick apartment building from built in the 1920s. And the building has changed hands numerous times over the last 8 years that I've lived here, all because, you know, generally they're speculating, trying to figure out how they can develop the property. And my previous landlord was Mallium. That was the last owners before the ones we have right now. And Mallium did their best to get us out, but I was able to fight my eviction, fortunately, at that point. And they also made life really unpleasant. They weren't looking after the property very well. And I remember looking in the paper one day and seeing a headline in the business section about Mallium. And the business columnist was praising this new developer in town for all the great things they were doing, and for the 50% return on investment that they were offering their investors. 50% profit is unheard of. I mean, I don't know if any of you have a savings account, but my savings account gets 0.01%. I mean, it's a terrible vehicle. I should definitely get my money out of that savings account, but that's, or, you know, savings accounts make 2%, 1%, whatever, right? 50% is a lot of money. And they were also getting grants from the city of Hamilton to develop. I mean, they were welcomed with open arms, but at any rate, they didn't succeed. They got tired of this building for some reason. I don't know why, but then it was bought by Collard Properties, who took over last year and promptly gave us all N13s, and also neglected the property even further, rarely taking the garbage out, just the halls were dirty and so on. So, and they have decided to well, they've been more successful at getting people out. So this is a 12-unit building, and it now only has 3 tenants left. A lot of the people were, but they took a buyout, and or they had moved in already at a higher rent from Mallium when they moved in when Mallium was owned it. So they were paying already $1,200 or whatever, and they were really pissed off that they weren't getting proper garbage removal and cleaning and so on. So a lot of people left because of that. And Collard is a really interesting company. They have a website, and they talk about on their website about being a real estate investor and how you too can retire early by becoming a real estate investor like us. And they tell you their strategies if you'll do their workshop. But a few of the strategies that I've become aware of are ones that they used here in our building. One of them is they like to buy buildings like ours from this era when there was asbestos in the buildings, in the walls, because as soon as they tell tenants that there's asbestos and they're going to have to remove it, so you better leave, then often tenants will move out because of that, because they're afraid of the asbestos. So they actually choose buildings for that reason. If you can imagine how cynical, how sinister, whatever the word is, I don't know, but to actually look for that. So they went ahead and did that here without telling us. They started remediating asbestos. And the way I found out was seeing a giant sign that said danger because they had already begun tearing apart the unit below me. They all had hazmat suits on, and they were doing it by the book. But there was dust in my unit. I was never told that this was happening, and I saw this dust, and I thought, well, shit, this probably has asbestos in it, and somebody should have told me and my the remaining tenants. But whatever, it's part of we don't give a shit about you. So anyways, the thing is that I just want to say a little bit about myself. I'm a trained artist. I have a master's degree in theater. I have taught as a sessional at McMaster University here in Hamilton. I was part of the arts, the new art scene here in Hamilton over the last decade that has helped bring in development. We were the first foot soldiers in the gentrification process. Art is the new steel was the slogan that Hamilton adopted, and we were the folks that helped make Hamilton a more attractive place for investors. And now people like myself and other artists I know who are also facing renovictions are being asked to piss off. Basically, I don't know where I would go to get this kind of an affordable apartment. I've looked around, I've looked at all kinds of other communities in Southern Ontario. And so I'm not sure where I'll be moving to, but Hamilton is certainly the rent that I'm paying right now. I would be paying double that if I get another unit of similar size in Hamilton. So I'd like to think that my city cares about its arts workers, but so far it hasn't proved to be the case. But I'm really excited to hear Councillor Jaimie's ideas, and I hope that we can be creative and work collectively and make our voices heard. Sorry if I've talked too long, but
No.
I really like how he said we decided to change our mindset. We decided to ask, what can we do? And I think that's really wonderful, that creative thinking, and also not seeing ourselves as victims, but remembering that this crisis is happening globally. It's a part of the unsustainable kind of, I hate to use the word capitalist, but it's that capitalist system where we're just nothing, we're just widgets, right? We're just an investment entity, we're not humans. And that's really dangerous, and it's not sustainable. It just can't go on anymore, and we know that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our next ACORN member speaker, Dawn Hode. Hode. Thank you,
No problem.
Dawn.
Okay, my name is Dawn Hode. I'm a tenant at 285 Melvin in East Hamilton. I've lived here for 9 years. I thought it was 8, but then I looked at the calendar and realized it's actually 9. There have been 2 owners of the building. The original owner, Harold Keane, sold the building to a Toronto company called family properties. And I usually do air quotes, but my hands are full. In 2019. The building is home to mostly seniors and low-income, long-term tenants. The neighborhood is called home by working class Hamiltonians, people on disabilities, newcomers, students, and many live on Melvin because it was the most affordable rent they could find at the time. Many people grew up in this neighborhood. Melvin is wonderfully located. I'm on the phone, I'm on a Zoom call. Melvin Avenue is on the bus line, it's close to grocery stores, schools, and it's convenient for everything. The previous owner, Harold Keene, refused to keep the building in good repair. After direct action from the press and ACORN and tenants, got the city to come in and do many repairs. And for a while, we were relieved when Mr. Keene finally sold the building. But the new landlord is even less interested in having the tenants live here. Last spring, the property manager, Raul, whatever his name is, offered me $2,000 to move out. At that time, I told him the only way I was leaving was feet first. My rent is $700.25, and my income on ODSP is $1,411. So this means half my income is going to rent, and I said no to the buyout. November 2020, the landlord gave tenants of 285 Melvin an N13 eviction notice, claiming major renovations at the building required tenants to move out by March 31st, 2021. All 58, there are 50 tenants in the building. There's more apartments than that, but a lot of the units were renovated as people moved out on their own before the buyout was offered. So 58 tenants in the building received this N13 notice. The notice letter came with a letter saying, you may be aware that this building has been in disrepair for many years. And under the Residential Tenancies Act, we are obligated to offer a maximum of 3 months rent, $2,100. However, if you decide to vacate and terminate your lease on or before March 31st, 2021, we are in good faith willing to give you a lump sum of $4,000. While we understand this letter may come as a surprise, we are well within our rights as building owners to terminate your tenancy.
Hey, Dawn.
Yeah.
I think you might have turned off your speaker. The audio just went down.
Oh, sorry. So here. Nope, that turned it down. Okay, is that better?
Someone's just suggesting there might be something covering your mic.
No. Is it better now, or? Let me see. I got headphones here somewhere. These are the mic on. Yes, they do.
And Dawn, if you just want to backtrack a bit, people really want to hear what you have to say.
Okay, is that better? Okay, great. So I'm not sure where I was left off, but I'll just go back a little bit. However, if you decide to vacate or terminate your lease on or before March 31st, 2021, we are in good faith willing to give you a sum of $4,000. While we understand this letter may come as a surprise, we are well within our rights as building owners to terminate your tenancy and do the necessary improvements required. We expect the renovations to last 7 to 10 months. So far, several tenants have taken the offer of money. Nothing in the letter suggests tenants can request to come back after renovations or that the notice is only a notice. Tenants have yet to receive a notice of hearing at Landlord-Tenant Board. During COVID, cleaning and pest control has gone, well, it says gone downhill, but it's just completely non-existent. The building never gets cleaned. They refuse to do pest treatments. Like, I don't know, earlier at the meeting, I jumped up because I had to stomp a cockroach. And And by the way, it's a myth that they excrete eggs when you step on them. They don't. If they have eggs in them, you kill the eggs too. So anyway, they refuse to do pest treatments. All my furniture is garbage now because it's so infested with bed bugs that it's just not, it's no way to recover it. I could see why some tenants would get frustrated and just take the money and run, but where do you go? There just is no place. Like when I called Housing Help Center, they told me I would have to be looking at shared accommodation. And when I looked at shared accommodation, most of those are student housing only, which is illegal because I know that they're not allowed to discriminate on somebody based on age or status, like rental status or anything else, but they are, and they do. And that's the only places I could find that were affordable, and that was like $730 a month. But there's no way I can afford market rent. I have no idea where I'm going to go. I'm terrified I'm going to end up in a tent. And they family properties did exactly the same thing to a building in Etobicoke. The only difference in their letter to ours is one character. They changed the $4,000 buyout to a $5,000 buyout. That's it. That was the only difference. So family properties has just made a practice of doing this. And I actually sent the property manager a text saying, how dare you call yourself family properties? We at 285 Melvin are a family. We all know each other. We've all, celebrated Halloween and, decorated for Christmas and all the rest of it, but they don't care. They're not in it for us. They're in it for what they can get. So I guess that's all I've really got to say.
Thanks, Dawn. Thank you for sharing that.
No problem.
Our next member, ACORN, is Darlene Wesley. Thanks, Darlene, for speaking to all of us today and sharing your experience.
Hey everyone, my name is Darlene Wesley. I'm going to read from my phone. I feel more comfortable that way. I've lived here at 309 Strathern for 17 years. The building has had 2 owners since then, and the current landlord for the past 6 years. My apartment is close to everything: transit, grocery stores, laundromats, gas station, center malls just down the street. The tenants here in the building, some work and in the neighborhood, actually some work in the neighborhood here. And I love it here. I've been here for 17 years. And if I didn't like it, I would have moved long ago. The current owner has tried to sell the building in 2019 and in 2020. And for some reason, the deals didn't go through. We had 2 inspections, and speaking to the inspectors, it passed with colors. So there's no need to do any renovations except for minor. Okay, that being said, the building has 5 units, all home to working class and low income tenants. One tenant has lived here even longer than I have. And I think his is like, I don't know, between 25 and 30 years. So, okay. While the building could be cleaned a little bit more once in a while, it's very livable. My daughter lives in the floor below me. And when she moved in, the apartment down there was renovated completely. And that was 6 years ago by the new owner. I pay $667 for a 1-bedroom apartment. And there is a unit in the building that became vacant, and he did a quick renovation on it, updated the bathrooms and the floors, threw some paint at it, and he increased it to $1,200 a month. And that's what he gets for over there. In October 2020, the landlord handed out N13s to 4 units first. And then when he thought that wasn't, he found his mistake, because if he was going to do all this permit work, then he should include the 5th apartment, which he did a week later. Okay, so then it says we have to be out by March 31st, 2021. Tenants in my building know their rights and nobody has moved yet. I know many of the tenants across Hamilton would take this notice as an eviction and move out, and many have, like Don said, and other speakers at our last meetings and such. Attached to the N13 notice were 2 pages describing the work that the landlord wants to do. It says that scant cosmetic renovations completed in the 50 years of the building, and to complete major renovations of the building to increase the value. The landlord estimates that the renovation will take approximately 6 months to complete. However, the estimate is barring any unforeseen circumstances, and it is not uncommon for variable factors such as supply shortages to affect the estimated time given. If the landlord goes forward with getting these permits and applying to the Landlord and Tenant Board for eviction, I will be entitled to $2,100 or $2,001 compensation. That would barely cover my moving costs and first and last month's rent. Nowhere near that anyways. Finding a short-term affordable lease will be impossible also. If the landlord wants to do renovations, they should find a way to do it with me living here, and therefore accommodate the tenant or accommodate the tenants during the renovations. He was asked to do that when the other apartment was empty. We said, why don't you give one of us that apartment, and then you could renovate the ones that the person is leaving, and then move us continuously until everything is done. He said no. He wanted the $1,200 first, and that's his objective, is his pocketbook. Okay, so I'm gonna get back to this. If I have to move, it would be devastating for me. I have COPD and other health problems, and I can't even pack up my own apartment, and I would never ever find this rent again. Rent is due in a few weeks, and I'm anxious for the tenants waiting for his next move, because with next month being the last month that we're supposed to be here, our last month's rent is already paid. So I'm wondering what he's going to say. You know, if he's going to approach us and say, you know, oh, you don't have to pay your rent, you're already paid because you're going to be moving. But, you know, none of us are going anywhere because we know it's just paper. Anyways, so I'm just anxious about that. Okay, thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Darlene. Thank
You're
you so much. Next, we'll have Elizabeth. She is our ACORN member, co-chair from the East End chapter. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Now, these are real issues affecting our community. Thank you to Paul, Don, and Darlene for sharing your story. The experience in renovations myself. Almost 2 years ago, it's actually almost 3 years ago, a privately owned company called Million bought my building. And within a year, 8 apartments were vacant. The landlord didn't offer us an N13, instead pressured all the tenants to take cash and says us to move out. I did my best to resist, but they finally wore me down. They bullied me. They called me, texted me, came to my apartment every day. So I ended up taking the buyout. They blamed the tenants for pest, switching rent payments online to a portal, even though they held back on repairs. It was almost about 2 years at 160 Sherman Avenue North, still isn't listed for rent. It's been after over 2 years and they still haven't got anybody renting those apartments. So they threw us all out for nothing. Whatever plans the landlord has, it wasn't for the best interests of the community. It's really uplifting to hear from Councillor McEvoy on the new Westminster to do the project tenants, and gratifying in raising rents and issues in most large urban cities in Canada. If we don't take action, who are our cities for? If we don't take actions, then what's going to happen to our city? We are here. We're hearing from ACORN members at our meetings that we have to leave Hamilton if the renovation happens to them. Many were born here. Some were pushed out. Nearby cities, the Greater Toronto, Hamilton, landing in Hamilton, and now they're searching for affordable rents. In December, a motion was passed at the Emergency Community Service Committee to investigate what other jurisdictions are doing to resist renovictions and come back with recommendations for Hamilton. ACORN looks forward to Hamilton can use its multiple powers to save Hamilton's market to affordable housing. We're going to pass it back to Mike Lopez.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So now everybody, we're heading into our Q&A period. So if you have any general comments, the chat space is open for that. Also for asking questions. You can use the raise hand feature in Zoom to ask a question. And if you're using the phone, you press *6 to unmute your phone. So with that, we have about, I think we're going about 15, 20 minutes for a Q&A for any of the speakers.